Let's take a look at this statement. I can describe the two domains in which criteria must be met to identify a child as having an intellectual and developmental disability, or IDD. In the resources section of our module, I've included the Minnesota criteria for students with DD, developmental delay, and those with DCD, which is developmental cognitive disability, also referred to as IDD. At this point, it's also important to note that DD is for children ages 3 to 6. By the age of 7, children must either qualify under IDD or DCD or another disability category if they are to receive or to continue to receive special education services. Before we start fully talking about intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's important to look at the history of the language surrounding these. When I was in elementary, middle, and high school, which was before 2007, by the way, the words mental retardation were commonly used to describe students who struggle cognitively. I'm so glad that this language has changed to something that is much more socially acceptable. While the language changed around this disability, the criteria has remained the same. Therefore, every individual who is or was eligible for a diagnosis of mental retardation is now eligible for a diagnosis of intellectual disability. And while this is the preferred term, it's also important to remember it takes time for language that's been used in legislation and regulation, and even for names of organizations to be able to change and to catch up. It's also important to note that the 1992 definition was the first to view intellectual disability as a condition that could be enhanced by provision of supports, rather than just a static, lifelong disability. Some of you may have seen or even been a part of the campaign by Special Olympics called Spread the Word to End the Word. Many of the years that I've been at Bethel, we've had students here raise money to spread awareness by selling shirts with the logo on your screen. Along with the information from your textbook, here are a few important facts to know and remember. 1 to 3% of Americans, approximately 6.5 million people, have an intellectual disability. More than 545,000 children ages 6 to 21, have some level of intellectual disability and receive special education services in public school under this category. When we look at someone who may have an intellectual and developmental disability, or IDD for short, there are two important domains to consider: intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. In addition, for a student to qualify for special education services in this disability category, the onset is before age 18. Intellectual functioning refers to the cognitive skills someone has. Adaptive behavior incorporates conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills that someone has. For a student to meet criteria with an intellectual or developmental disability, they must show need in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. Before we unpack these a bit further, it's important for you to know that with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the criterion differs between what's required for a student to qualify for services in a school setting and what is required for a student to receive services such as healthcare, etc. It's important to know that the disability must have a negative impact on the child's ability to receive educational services for a student to qualify in this area. The first domain that a student must meet when considering whether or not they have an intellectual or developmental disability is the area of cognitive skills. Cognitive skills are what we generally refer to as someone's IQ, or intellectual quotient. Students who are part of a special education evaluation looking at intellectual or developmental disabilities are given an IQ test, most often by the school psychologist. The chart on your screen shows how below average intellectual functioning is defined by a student's score. One of the criteria that must be met for a student to qualify in this area is an IQ of 70 or below. The second domain that a student must meet is the area of adaptive skills. As you can see on your screen, there are 3 pieces to this: practical skills, conceptual skills, and social skills. Take a minute and read through the bullet points to get a better idea of what falls under each category. When we look at the Minnesota criteria for a student to qualify for special ed services under this disability category, adaptive skills are broken out into 7 behavior domains, and a student must require support in at least 4 of these 7 in multiple environments, so home, school, community, to qualify. The 7 behavior domains fall into the original 3 categories as shown below. Oftentimes, I find that there can be a nervousness or uncomfortableness around those who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. Remember, however, that an intellectual disability is not a disease. It's not something you can catch from someone. It's not a mental illness like depression, and there's no cure for intellectual disabilities. But most children with an intellectual disability can learn to do many, many things. It just takes them a little more time and a bit more effort than most other children. Sometimes an intellectual disability is caused by abnormal genes inherited from parents or errors when genes combine. Some examples of genetic conditions are Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome or PKU. An intellectual disability can also result when a baby doesn't develop inside a mother properly. For example, there may be a problem with the way the baby's cells divide as it grows. Or a woman who drinks alcohol or gets an infection like rubella during pregnancy may also end up with a baby that has an intellectual disability. If a baby has problems during labor and birth, such as maybe not getting enough oxygen, he or she may have an intellectual disability. Diseases like whooping cough, the measles, or meningitis also can cause intellectual disabilities, or something like extreme malnutrition, or not getting the proper medical care, or being exposed to poisons like lead or mercury. In short, there's just not one simple reason or one gene that is responsible for IDD. So what might you observe with a child who has an intellectual or developmental disability? As you read through this list, notice that there are skills that fall under practical, conceptual, and social areas. Now that you know what to be aware of and look for, how exactly do schools determine if a student meets criteria? Well, this is where your special ed team and the school psychologist have an important role to play. They are the team at school that will administer various assessments as part of a special education evaluation. And while you don't need to memorize the names of these examples, you should be familiar with them, as you will likely hear them referenced to in IEP meetings. So what does a child with IDD look like? Take a few minutes to look at the video that I've included on our Moodle site for this week. Meet Jack. In addition, take a look at the resources included for DD criteria and DCD criteria.